Hello and welcome to my final talk through revision about Germany 1899-45. This time we're looking at life during the Second World War and also the opposition the Nazis faced. Okay, so have a look at this video a few times and then develop your knowledge. I'm going to tell you about life during the war and how the Second World War impacted life on the home front for people in Germany, but also about opposition during the war, but also other time periods of Nazi Germany and how that opposition was dealt with or not dealt with. Then, once you revise your knowledge, of course, as I say in all my videos, I have tutoring videos to help you practice questions as well, so do look out for those as well. Now let's go to those key notes. Let's start with probably one of the more obvious types of opposition, which is the church. Now it's obvious because Hitler stood really in opposition to what the church stood for. They stood for a certain moral code which Hitler was against. Also, Hitler wanted people to follow him in almost like a godlike figure, and so obviously that stood in opposition to much what the church stood for. You'll remember in my Life in Germany video that there was a Christian church called the German Christians, and they were very much Nazified. So there was, of course, an opposition element to that. There's the Confessional church, and Martin Niemöller, they stood against the German Christians and they wanted an end to Nazification of the church. He set up the non-Nazi church, as I said, called the Confessional Church. He was eventually placed in a concentration camp for having set up this church and leading sermons that preached against the Nazi ideas. Also, there was some Catholic opposition as well. In 1941, the Catholic Archbishop of Münster von Galen led a successful campaign against the euthanasia of mentally disabled and physically disabled people. So you might remember from my race video that there was an idea of trying to gain racial perfection in Germany, and so euthanasia was brought in to remove mentally and physically disabled people, and Galen successfully removed this as a public policy. Now there's also another church person called Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He is a Protestant, but he didn't necessarily gain fame by preaching from the pulpit against the Nazis. Yes, he did lead campaigns against the Nuremberg laws and was a church official preaching against the Nazis, but possibly his more famous part was joining Abwehr, which was a secret underground group plotting to overthrow Hitler, and he was involved in talk around his assassination and trying to kill him. October 1942 he was arrested, and 1944 sent to a concentration camp, and he eventually died in 1945. So there were religious people involved in the plots to kill Hitler. Now, talking about plots to kill Hitler, of course, during the Second World War, there was the military opposition and the famous July bomb plot. So by 1943, Germany was being defeated, as it were, by Russia, and some military leaders wished to stop the war, and this might be because they feared the Russian revenge. When Germany had invaded Russia, they'd been brutal, murdering people, murdering the officers, murdering the communist Tsars. They worried about revenge on themselves, mass murder of the German leadership and the officers in the army. But also they knew that the Germanic state was very brutal, and they knew about the Holocaust, and they didn't agree with some of these things. So they tried to remove Hitler. So what happened in July bomb plot? Well, a group of army officers, an intellectual called the Kreisau Circle, they led this bomb plot. Colonel Stauffenberg was going to a meeting. He sat next to Hitler in the meeting. He put the bomb down next to him, and then Stauffenberg left the meeting. Unfortunately for Stauffenberg, while he was out of the meeting, somebody knocked over the briefcase containing the bomb. They moved it away from Hitler. Also, the actual bomb itself was in a wooden hut rather than the normal concrete bunker. So when the explosion took place, firstly the bomb was further away from Hitler, and secondly, rather than exploding inwards due to a concrete bunker, it exploded outwards and caused less damage. So von Stauffenberg arrived in Berlin thinking he'd killed Hitler and starting to plan a revolution, but instead he and his co-conspirators were arrested and executed. So another type of opposition was during World War II as well. So as the tide began to turn and the Nazis started to lose, and also as people start to realise the brutal policies of the Nazis and start to protest against them, groups like the White Rose Group campaign against Nazis. A group of socialist students at the university led by Sophie Scholl published anti-Nazi leaflets and handed them out all around the university, but were obviously caught and eventually executed. Now, it might be a really important point to note around Sophie Scholl and the White Rose Group that their opposition to policies of euthanasia and racial cleansing suggests that the years of propaganda and indoctrination that the Nazis had led had failed, and this could be a really good example of that. Other policies seem to have failed for young people by the Second World War. The whole idea of indoctrinating Germans to be more traditional Germanic and conservative seems to have failed, as groups like the Swing Youth developed. They liked American jazz music and music of black origin, and they liked those big band type music. They rejected Nazi values. They drank alcohol, women danced, women wore shorter clothes. These were not the traditional values of women that the Nazis expected to see. Some people were sent to camps to be re-educated, and Hassel Schützendorf had to push a heavy cart for 2 weeks as part of his re-education. The Hitler Youth groups also started to fall into decay during the war. Many of their leaders, young men who'd led the Hitler Youth groups, had to go to war. So the Hitler Youth groups were left with older people, maybe not as good, not as well respected by young people. And of course there was the decay of the home front anyway, that meant that young people were not very happy during the war. Mothers could be going off to work and children left to their own devices to some extent. So a decline in the idea of Nazi family values perhaps at this time. And so we get youth groups like the Edelweiss Pirates develop. And these are anti-Nazi youth groups. They had anti-Nazi slogans, they hid deserters from the army, they beat up Nazi officials, they attacked Nazi Hitler Youth groups when they're out on their parades or their expeditions. Perhaps the most spectacular example of the Edelweiss Pirates leading the attack were the Cologne Pirates in 1944, and they killed the local Gestapo chief. And here you can see a picture of them being executed. All 12 were rounded up and executed. So what about life during the war for people in Germany? Well, opposition, of course, is one thing you could talk about, that people started to oppose the Nazis more. Youth and social groups and a sort of decline in their policies was one thing you can definitely talk about. But life generally is about bombing of towns and cities and rationing as a couple of key examples to talk about as well. So let's start with bombings of town and cities. So the bombings of town and cities particularly began from about 1942. Germans started to lose control of the air as the Americans joined the war in Europe. Of course, the bombing of cities led to huge amounts of injuries and deaths due to bombs and gas explosions. There were bombings of industry in particular. So one famous example is the Ruhr being bombed with the dam busters. So the Ruhr was quite a watery area. They needed dams to power it. The dam busters destroyed the dams to power the industry there. And this was a great propaganda boost for the Allies. However, it only stopped the industrial production for a couple of days. But it shows that trying to bomb industrial areas was a key part of the Allied strategy, and obviously there'd be casualties in those areas. Of course, cities within total war also got bombed. Total war is the thing now, the indiscriminate bombing of towns and cities. Yes, they have industry, but it's also about trying to create the home front as an area of defeat or victory, as well as the battlefront. So a couple of examples of big bombings were Hamburg, 1943. The city was bombed, but a firestorm developed after the bombing and 30,000 people died. And then, of course, the much more famous one was 1945. Dresden was bombed with carpet bombing. The city was flattened. Up to 150,000 people died. Now, of course, these bombings also created huge amounts of refugees, people fleeing these town cities. So there was over 1 million refugees without homes moving from towns to countryside across Germany as well. Total war also meant rationing and non-essentials were closed. People had to adapt their lives to some extent. So sweet shops were closed, beer halls were closed, clubs were closed, postal services were cancelled. People had to accept there were fewer things in life. So the propaganda increased around the idea of making a sacrifice for total war. The film Kohlberg was given, and it was all about the heroic resistance to Napoleon, and it was a message about working hard to survive a crisis and all pulling together in times of trouble. So rationing had been something that was taking place from the start of the war. From 1939, cloves and butter were rationed, and if you think back to Nazi economic policies, you've learnt about the 4-year plan hadn't been a total success by 1940, so Germany was not a self-sufficient autarky, and therefore dairy in particular and some meats and some foods were a real struggle. So 1 egg per week was allowed from about 1939 as another example of rationing. Hot water was rationed to only twice a week, and soap was rationed, so pine needles was recommended as an alternative to make sure you smell nice. Finally, labour shortage was something to consider. There was a lack of labour in the munitions factory, so women would need to work. About 1 million joined the workforce. However, Hitler was against this, and initially he tried to concentrate only on slave labour and foreign labour. About 7 million were used. But as Germany started to lose the war and their land scaled down, women were required to work in the factories making weapons. Factories were forced to stay open for much longer hours as well. Good, I hope you found that useful, revising your knowledge on that. Now, Germany during the war is one of those topics that is one of the smaller topics that maybe the examiners think you haven't revised, so make sure you know some of your key facts. Very simple to talk about: rationing, opposition, and bombings. Very simple to talk about some of those stresses and strains in life. So do have a good look through some of those and have a look through my tutoring question and my revision guide, and I've got some questions you can practice around that theme. Okay, well, do subscribe and do recommend me, and hope to see you soon. Bye bye.